This is Mark Lane.
This is Robert Groden.
This is Dick Russell.
This is Jim Mars.
This is Lisa Pease.
This is Dr. David Mantic.
This is Cyril Weck.
This is Jim DiEugenio.
This is Joan Mellon.
This is David Lifton.
This is Jerry Pollicott.
This is Gary Shaw.
This is Bill Kelly.
This is Greg Burnham.
This is Gerald McKnight.
This is Sherry Feaster.
This is Joseph McBride.
This is Dave Ratcliffe.
This is David Talbot.
This is Doug Horne.
This is Walt Brown.
This is John Barber.
This is Bill Pepper.
This is Richard Belzer.
This is Oliver Stone.
This is Governor Jesse Ventura, and you're listening to Black Op Radio.
Video computers online. Archiving 44K. Initiate sequence.
T-minus 30 seconds.
Server connection confirmed.
T-minus 25 seconds.
Live stream 21 and 20K.
T-minus 20 seconds.
Phone lines are go.
T-minus 15 seconds.
Satellite uplink verified.
T-minus 10 seconds.
Mic check complete. Satellite uplink verified.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Black Op Radio, the voice of political conspiracy research. You're listening to Black Op Radio, the show NSA doesn't want you to hear. Now here is your host, Leno Sanek.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Black Op Radio. Today we are talking to historian Doug Horne, well known in the JFK research community for work on many aspects of it, and writing author, I should add to that as well. So welcome, Doug.
Oh, thank you, Len. It's good to be back on your program.
Today, we are talking about a new book, Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War. And this is detailing Pearl Harbor, and there is a lot here. I think when we were young, we were told that on December 7th, there was a surprise attack. Out of nowhere, the Japanese attacked the American base, and a day of infamy, and there appears to be, when you look into it, a real dark history to this. So, first of all, I guess I'll just ask, where is the book available, and then what got you interested in writing in this topic?
The book can be purchased, Len, at Amazon.com. You can type in my last name, Horne, and the word FDR, or you can type in the title, Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War. It's a 2-volume book. Each volume is $30, but you're going to get your money's worth. The total page length, I think, is 742 pages. There's one heck of a lot of footnotes, a great bibliography, and an index this time. So I would encourage people to take the plunge. And what got me interested in this would be a lifetime of reading about the Great Pacific War and about 3 decades of reading about Franklin Roosevelt. I guess I would have to call myself a revisionist historian about Pearl Harbor, but I would say that there's one big difference between me and all the other revisionists that I know of, is that I approached this subject as an admirer of FDR, and I finished my 6 years of research and writing still an admirer of FDR, even though I believe he did have foreknowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack. I believe he had foreknowledge about 11 days before it happened, and I know we'll get into that. But so unlike the other revisionists who I talk about in my book and who I often quote, I don't consider him a warmonger or an evil man. I consider him a great president.
I'm surprised to hear you say that after reading the book, because, I tell you what, there's 2 quotes that I wanted to start with, and let me just get to that then. So, I'm sure everyone's heard of Pearl Harbor and they know the rough outline, but from your page 505 at the bottom, you quote here, or I'm quoting you then, it is the thesis of this book that Churchill did share a warning about Pearl Harbor to Roosevelt on November 26, 1941, and that Roosevelt suppressed information. And this information is that the attack was coming. Now, that's a little surprising right there. That's a little shocking. And then the second quote that, is as amazing is from Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. And the quote is, "You know I am a juggler. I never let my right hand know what my left hand is doing. I may have one policy for Europe and one diametrically opposed for North America. I may be entirely inconsistent and furthermore perfectly willing to mislead and tell untruths if it will help win the war. Now that's quite
a great quote, and I think I use it about 3 times in the book. That's right.
Well, say what you want about someone. With those 2 quotes, what you're revealing is that an entire nation went to war and was not told the truth about it. And furthermore, did America entice and goad Japan into attacking him, something they may not have done? And if they did that, and if you get this juggler Roosevelt saying, I'm not going to tell people I'm perfectly fine with lying to the American public if it will win a war, but win a war that didn't have to happen? I mean, this is the question. So,
right, because of the unique nature of that war and the unique nature of the United States role, I consider this a special case. And I do believe that the war was inevitable. We were going to get in sooner or later, and the question was, would it be too late to make a difference? We'll be getting into that. But yes, Roosevelt, what you're telling us, he was a very complex man, and he was Machiavellian at times. And in fact, in response to the quotes you've given us, I think a good place to start is with a very brief overview of his personality, because it runs through the thread of this entire story. He was a champion of the common man. He was a strong advocate of human rights and individual freedoms. He despised the British Empire and colonialism and mercantilism and strongly supported free trade and self-determination for all peoples. And that's where he clashed with Churchill, in this area. He was a Wilsonian internationalist, which means that he believed in the interdependency of modern nations and in avoiding war through engagement, with other countries, not through isolationism. He was an opponent of isolationism and fascism. Now, his personality was indeed many-faceted and compartmentalized, Len. One biographer described his personality as one of bewildering complexity. He could be bold or cautious, informal or dignified, cruel or kind, intolerant or long-suffering, urbane or almost rustic, impetuous or temporizing, and here's that word again, Machiavellian or moralistic. He was always performing. FDR once told the great actor Orson Welles that they were the 2 greatest actors in America. That's a heck of a quote. He did not keep a diary and intentionally left, very few records or documents recording his private planning or strategy. There were different extremes in the way different people viewed him, depending upon their relationship with him. Harry Truman, after his death, Vice President Truman said, he was the coldest man I ever met. And in fact, one of his cabinet members described him that way at one time when they were having a spat, and that was Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes. The 2 quotes that are my favorites are, one is by columnist Walter Lippmann, who said, quote, Roosevelt was a wonderful finagler. He loved to take a complicated thing, which involved a certain amount of deception, hornswoggling of people, and somehow get it done, unquote. And one other historian, a recent historian, John Meacham, who wrote the book Franklin and Winston, about the 2,000 letters and telegrams they exchanged, Roosevelt and Churchill, his quote is as follows, quote, what could make Roosevelt a trying husband and a frustrating friend could make him a great president. Sometimes politicians have to pursue different courses at the same time and deceive those closest to them about what they are doing, end quote. So ultimately, the inner FDR, as opposed to the performing one and the public one, was detached, somewhat impenetrable, and most of the time enigmatic, a sphinx. Now, it's greatly ironic to me, Len, that in the pursuit of ends consistent with what I call his altruistic core values, FDR could employ means that were devious and duplicitous, elusive and dissembling, and manipulative. Yes, he's a very complex person, and he was a person concerned with ends and not means. So I guess perhaps I should try to respond to your slight astonishment here at the beginning of the interview and maybe explain why it doesn't bother me so much that Roosevelt withheld knowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack from most of the government and certainly withheld it from the commanders in Hawaii. Perhaps I should explain myself.
Well, just before we get into that, right, I just wanted to say, being Canadian, you know, when I heard of these chats that he would put on and that, I mean, I thought of an uncle, maybe a doddering grandfather or something. And when you say the word Machiavellian, we're taking it to a new level that I was totally unaware of, from this public persona, which I knew, just at arm's length.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, that's true. The public persona was generally one of considerable personal charm. He generally displayed a relaxed style in public and exhibited a good sense of humor, unless he was angry. And then when he was angry, he could give a good stem winder in the way of a speech when it was necessary. But throughout his career, he was generally known as a charmer, and a lot of people, I would say, underestimated him as a lightweight until they learned a little bit more about him, and then
until it was too late.
Until they felt outmaneuvered, right?
Okay, so I think just to set the stage a little bit, World War II is starting. I think the biggest thing that is surprising that 86%, I think, of Americans were against getting into any war. In Europe, there's fighting. There's Poland. There's Czechoslovakia. There's France. German Nazis are creating havoc everywhere, but yet at home in America, they were just saying, listen, that's their problem. We don't want in. And on the surface, you get the impression that Churchill and the United States, England, were great allies and they're friends, and yet I find out that this isn't entirely the case, as you just alluded to. So we should just let people know who the players were. They were talking about Churchill. We're talking about this era of before America's into the war.
Sure.
This is what FDR is up against, that I think he wanted to help the UK, but also I think to some end that he was going to also end colonialism. That, colonialism.
Right.
If they started if they started lending money to the UK, it would be, okay, after that, these other countries are going to go free. And that's what's going to happen. And England didn't want that to end. I think they wanted to.
Right. Let me jump in here, maybe,
Sure.
In the way of background is in World War I, America entered the war late, and our entry late in the war with the American Expeditionary Force in Europe tipped the balance when the Allies, the French and the British, were fighting the Germans and the Turks, mostly just the Germans, and Russia was already knocked out of the war by Germany, and both sides were exhausted. And America's late entry into the war made the difference and caused the Germans to surrender. They were economically prostrate and were starting to lose a lot of soldiers. Even though they were deep in France and Belgium and Holland, they were exhausted. And one of the problems following the war is that President Wilson, who had, of course, created the League of Nations, he got ahead of his own country, and his country didn't want to join the League of Nations. They didn't want any part of collective security, and so that destroyed his career and destroyed him personally, and was a weakness in that concept of collective security. And even worse, the British, who had received many war loans from American banks, decided during the hard times of the 1920s that they were going to renounce all of their war debts to the United States and said, we can't pay these. And so refused to pay back their war loans. So what developed in America in the late 20s and during the 1930s was this sense of outrage that we're not going to go to war anymore to bail out Europe, especially to bail out the British Empire and pull their chestnuts out of the fire, or the French. They're on their own. And besides, look what they did to us. They didn't pay back the war loans. So there were many books written in the mid-1930s. There were congressional investigations basically alleging that America's entry into World War I was engineered by, these were the allegations, that our entry was engineered by arms merchants and bankers. So there was a lot of strong isolationist feeling and a sense that why do it again? What's it gonna bring about? And the attitude was nothing. So when the war began on September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, after first gobbling up, without firing a shot, Austria and having Czechoslovakia handed to him by the British and the French, when he begins the war, the bloodletting on September 1st against Poland, of course, the American nation is strongly isolationist, and Roosevelt says the things publicly that he knows people want to hear, which is that, we may have strong sides in this war, we may have strong opinions, but we're going to stay out of the war, and but I can't control the way you feel, and I can't control your opinions, but we're going to try to stay out of the war, and I think we can. That's how he started talking in September 39, but immediately he began taking actions that said otherwise. So the first set of actions he took was to try to amend the Neutrality Acts, which were passed in the mid-30s, which he reluctantly signed at the time and later regretted it, which said the U.S. cannot trade with belligerents, cannot trade with nations at war, cannot send materials to them on our ships either. And so he got the Neutrality Act amended in November of 39 to say that we'll do cash and carry. In other words, if a nation at war will give us cash on the barrelhead, we're not going to do any war loans. They'll give us cash, and they'll take it away on their own ships. We'll sell munitions to other countries. Now, this blatantly favored the British and the French because they had the merchant marine. They had the large navies, especially the British, and the Germans did not have a large merchant marine. So although we were officially still a neutral nation, that started us down the road to moving toward what the historians call belligerency, or moving toward picking a side and not being neutral anymore. And that slope got steeper and steeper. Now, that statistic you gave, about 86%, it was probably 86 or 90 or something when the war started. People didn't want to get into the war. And even at the end of my story, where my book ends with Pearl Harbor, even then, between 75 to 80% of the American people in December 1941 did not want to enter the war and did not want to fight Germany. And when I say the war, I mean World War II in Europe. That's what I'm talking about. And so this is what Roosevelt was fighting. He, as the Nazi regime became more and more detestable during the 1930s, and then as they began to rape Europe, and, you know, the rape accelerated in 1940 when Hitler invaded Norway and Denmark in April 1940, and then the big invasion of the West, Belgium, Holland, and France in May. And, of course, he quickly overran those countries and kicked the British Army off the continent. They were lucky they didn't all get captured. They almost did. But most of his army got away from Dunkirk with this fleet of over 800 ships, but without any cannon and without any tanks. So, and they were basically unarmed. Half of them didn't have rifles anymore. So what Roosevelt's intention was, clearly, it's very clear to me, from May of 1940, when Hitler launched his big offensive in the West, through December of 1941, his goal was to, number one, prevent the defeat of Great Britain by providing as much material aid as we could, as he was permitted to do by the Congress and by the country. Number two, once Germany attacked Russia the following year, that was in June 41, to not let the USSR go under, especially not them, because that's where the bulk of the fighting was going on, and that's where most of the blood was being shed. And he was smart enough to know that whoever wins that conflict between Germany and the USSR that's going to largely determine the winner of World War II in Europe. And of course, his third goal, I'm absolutely convinced, was to not only prepare America to enter the war from the standpoint of materiel, building ships and airplanes and increasing the size of our army, but to actually get us in the war. But he was determined, I'm convinced, not to take a disunited country into the war. That's the last thing he wanted to do. So he embarked, as soon as the war started in September 1939, he embarked upon a program of public education of the American people. He gave many, many speeches about the war and about how we're not protected anymore by oceans because of the modern airplane and because of the submarine, and people shouldn't feel secure. And this education program of his continued with many, many, many formal speeches, fireside chats, you name it, special addresses to Congress. And he did persuade the American people rather successfully to provide all aid short of war to Great Britain. And of course, the pinnacle of that was the Lend-Lease program, which was proposed by him late in December 1940 at a press conference, and then proposed by him in a speech on December 29th, the Arsenal of Democracy speech, the most famous fireside chat he ever gave, and then in his inaugural address the next month in January 41, he formalized the request. And the Lend-Lease bill, after much debate, was passed by considerable margins in Congress in March 1941. So he was giving them everything they needed and wanted for free, and of course, in the process, we're building up our war industries and getting ready to fight. But the American people were wary of him, and the isolationist movement was I'd say about a third of the American people, but they were very loud-spoken. They controlled most of the Midwestern newspapers, Midwestern radio stations, and then you had these internationalist / interventionist even on the East Coast, who believed in getting into the war. So he was like a ship trying to negotiate a minefield, moving very slowly and very cautiously at what he thought was a safe speed. And I think the one thing the audience should know about him is that Roosevelt had made one big mistake in his presidency before the war started, and that was his attempt to pack the Supreme Court with extra justices who were favorable to him. He tried to do that in 1937 after he was reelected. He was reelected in a landslide in 1936. And that was after saving the banking system and after providing a social safety net and public works programs to try to basically to try to save capitalism in America and to try to prevent a revolution. So he was reelected in a landslide, and then he overreached and tried to pack the Supreme Court and knock down all these Supreme Court decisions that were basically underpinning his New Deal. Many of his New Deal programs had been declared unconstitutional by this very conservative court. So he wanted to pack the court. Not only did his scheme fail and did he not have the votes in Congress to pull it off, but he suffered great embarrassment over this, and people started to distrust him. And then he tried to exact revenge on opponents of his over that court packing scheme in 1938, and he campaigned against several congressmen who had opposed it, and he didn't unseat anybody. So he was a slightly wounded president in 1939 when the war began, and he suddenly had to shift his focus from domestic concerns, which he had been almost totally obsessed with domestic concerns through 1938, and then almost totally shift his focus to foreign policy and this what to do about this war in Europe.
Right, and when you take that into consideration, you start to realize when he wants to get something done, he can't go about it above board in the usual way. There was talk of if anyone was going to even vote and discuss going to war, it would be a minimum of 3 months in the Congress.
That's right.
They would just...
That's right. That's right. In fact, that's what he told Churchill at this... in fact, maybe it's time to talk about that conference. Roosevelt went to sea in secret in August of 1941, and Churchill went to sea in secret, and they met, the ships of these two leaders met off of Newfoundland, off the east coast of your country, at a place called Argentia. I hope I'm saying it right, which was a very remote location. They had a conference that lasted 4 days, and there was a public part of the conference, what they told the public about it afterwards, which I call the smokescreen, and that's the Atlantic Charter. And there's the private part of the conference with two big promises made secretly by President Roosevelt to Churchill in private, which the American people did not know about until after the war. And if they had known about these promises, he would have been impeached and removed. I do believe so. So let me set the stage for this conference, because I think it's the lens through which we have to view what happened at Pearl Harbor. So the Lend-Lease bill is passed. Well, first, let me back up a little bit. First, France is overrun. Denmark and Holland and Belgium are overrun, and Norway. The British army's kicked off the continent of Europe. Britain's hanging on by her fingernails against Germany. And basically because Hitler doesn't have a strong navy, and because he cannot win the Battle of Britain, it's basically a draw, he can't invade England in September 1940, because if he had been able to get his troops across, the war would have been over. And then he would have been allowed after that, he would have been allowed to have his one front war against his life enemy, the USSR, but he couldn't knock England out. And so what Roosevelt does in the middle of all this crisis, during the Battle of Britain, when it's just heating up, after thinking about it for 3 months, he decides to take a big risk to help Churchill and to help the British people hang on. So he finally, after 3 months of dilly-dallying, he finally decides to give Churchill 50 old U.S. Navy destroyers from World War I, four stacked destroyers, which had been in mothballs. And he knows that if he goes to Congress, it's going to be debated forever, and they may not approve it. So he gets the Attorney General to say that it's legal. And there was a big public relations campaign that he engineered with a lot of East Coast lawyers publishing articles in the paper and people making speeches saying we should do this. And he finally just announces it. It was called the Destroyers for Bases deal. And he announced it. It was signed on September 2nd, 1940. Roosevelt announced it the 3rd. And it was basically a fait accompli. He got away with this. But at the time, he told people in private that he may get impeached and removed from office because of this. Because obviously Hitler could have considered that an act of war. He might have. He didn't, but he might have. And as it turned out, he didn't get impeached. And he took this tremendous risk in the middle of a presidential election where he was running for a 3rd term as U.S. president. No one else had ever done that. So it was a big risk. It paid off. The destroyers ended up not being that useful. They were very old ships. There were many delays in their delivery. Many of them had to be extensively repaired before and then after they were delivered. But it was a big morale boost to the British, and it helped grease the skids for the future flow of arms and weapons to Great Britain. So, and what we got for the destroyers was the use of the lease of 8 British bases in the Western Hemisphere for 99 years. And one of those bases was in this place called Argentia in Newfoundland. And at that location, at a place called Placentia Bay, Churchill went over there in the Prince of Wales, a new battleship, and in secret. And Roosevelt went up in a heavy cruiser, and they met up there. And for 4 days, they talked and went to church together, but mostly argued. And people didn't know that at the time either. They spent the first 2 days arguing about the British Empire, with Roosevelt telling Churchill in private that the American people do not want to go to war to save the British Empire. You people have not treated your colonies very well, and all you do is steal, materials from them. You don't uplift them by education. And of course, I don't think he was talking about Canada. I think he was talking about a lot of the other colonies. I think he was talking about places in Africa and talking about India. But at any rate, so they got that out of their systems. And of course, Churchill would have loved a declaration of war against Germany. And Roosevelt says, I can't do that. If I ask Congress for a declaration of war, they'll debate it for 3 months. And of course, that was true. And not only would they have debated it for 3 months, Len, but even if he had won the debate and the Congress had declared war on Germany, we would have had a severely divided country. And that's not a way to go to war, which America found out about, during the Vietnam conflict. That is not the way to go to war with a divided country. So Roosevelt said to him, I can't ask for a declaration of war. I can't declare war. But he said in secret to Churchill, I'll make war. I'll make war on Germany in the Atlantic. I'll conduct an undeclared war against German U-boats, the ones that are savaging your merchant ships. And he said, in the hopes of stimulating an incident, which would serve as a casus belli. So there's that Latin word again, a pretext or a cause of war, a casus belli. So Roosevelt said, I'll become more and more provocative, and if Hitler doesn't like it, he can attack U.S. forces. So that's what he told him in private, and we know about that because they had note takers at the secret meetings, and the British cabinet minutes is what was recorded. So when Churchill reported, what I should have said is there were note takers at the cabinet meeting. So when Churchill got back, he related all this to his cabinet, and this was recorded by the official minutes, and then they were declassified after the war. And not only that, but Roosevelt also promised Churchill at Argentia that he would start convoying British ships with U.S. Navy warships. He would start escorting British convoys with U.S. Navy warships in September. So those were the two promises. One was to convoy British merchant ships with U.S. Navy warships, which surely Hitler might have considered an act of war. and it surely was going to stimulate incidents. And the second promise was that he'd make war, an undeclared war on the German Navy, in the hopes that there would be an incident. So two of Churchill's principal aides, his personal secretary and his official secretary, they both heard this conversation. They put it in their notes and their books later. And, of course, it was also in the cabinet minutes. Now, in regards to Japan, what Churchill wanted at the Argentia conference, he wanted Roosevelt and the Dutch government in exile and the British to issue a three-way joint declaration to Japan saying that if you attack British, telling Japan that if you attack British colonies in the Far East, this will mean war with America. And so Roosevelt says, no, I don't want to do that. He says, I'll baby them along. Those were the words he used. I'm going to baby them along and gain us at least 30 days, maybe 3 months, so we can both send reinforcements to the Far East. So at this time, certainly, and the record shows it, Roosevelt, his primary focus was on getting into the war against Hitler. First of all, preventing England from going under, preventing the Soviet Union from going under once they became involved in the war in June 41, once Germany attacked them, and with trying to find a way to either upset Hitler so much that he just declared war on America. For example, convoying British ships with U.S. Navy might have caused that. Attacking U-boats might have caused that. At the time, Hitler didn't want to fight the U.S. He was preoccupied with Russia, so he didn't respond to those provocations. But in other circumstances, he might have. But as it turns out, he didn't.
That's something we should discuss for a moment. And I should mention that in your books, you lay out dates, times, official documents, and everything is in order. And then at the end, there is your conclusions. And so what we're kind of doing is we're giving this general overview. We haven't even gotten to Pearl Harbor yet, but we're laying the background here. And a couple of things I didn't know about at all, so I just want to bring them up. I think people, without getting into this, is that what you talked about is this Germany, Italy, Japan pact. Right. I forget. It started with try something. But
the
anyway.
tripartite pact. Right,
okay, tripartite, right. And so what you're getting at it is that if somebody attacked Italy or Japan, they would all stick together.
Right.
And I didn't really understand this first until I read into it and looked in, through your book, and that is that I thought that German U-boats were shooting Americans left and right, but they were under strict orders not to. And
that's right.
I think that what they had, some kind of spy or infiltrations, that they recognized that America was looking for any incident, that if they could get them into the war, they would. So there was some stern cables from the high command of Germany to, at all cost, avoid any American ship at all.
That's right. I think one of those orders went out the day before he attacked Russia. Was under no circumstances will any U-boats fire at U.S. ships.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's astounding. I didn't know about that. And then, I guess to back that up further, like you said, Roosevelt was ordering American ships to go out there and cause something. There was 3 incidents, weren't there? That
there were. Before I get into those, that's what we should talk about next. Is the dramatic incidents that did occur, and what happened. What did the American people think about that, and how did Roosevelt try to use those incidents? But before we jump into that.
Sure.
He came home from that conference. Oh, by the way, the public smokescreen at the conference was a document called the Atlantic Charter, which the British gagged on and really didn't want to sign. But Roosevelt says, he says, first of all, your audience has to understand, Roosevelt was so secretive and Machiavellian that he did not even take with him his Secretary of State or his Secretary of War or his Secretary of the Navy, because War and Navy, Stimson and Knox they wanted to get in the war. They thought we should have been in the war already, and so he didn't want to take them to that conference. He didn't want people promising things prematurely.
Well, like you itemized, never mind he didn't take them. He didn't even tell them about it.
That's right. He didn't even tell them. They were informed after he left in secret. So look, he gets back from so the Atlantic Charter is issued as a smokescreen so that the isolationists back home in the U.S. will be put to sleep, and they won't think that Roosevelt was making a secret deal to go to war, which, as it turns out, he was. But the smokescreen says that following the war, after Nazi Germany is defeated, all of the victorious nations will, in so many words, create a United Nations. I'm not sure they use that exact language, but they use language which implied there will be an international peacekeeping body. And he said everyone will have self-determination for their political future and free trade after the war. And boy, the British hated that, because that meant if taken literally, it meant the end of their empire. But he basically forced them to sign it. You want my help? I'm giving you everything you want for free, all the weapons and airplanes you want for free. You got to play ball. So they signed it, and that was what was publicly announced. But when Roosevelt gets home, he finds out that we've intercepted a secret message from Hitler to Japan. Now let me explain what this is about, and then we'll talk about those incidents at sea. There were two types of code breaking going on that are a big factor in my book, or in any book that studies this period. And one is the Japanese diplomatic codes, which the United States began breaking in September of 1940. We invented a machine, and it literally, as if by magic, decoded all the Japanese high-level diplomatic messages from Tokyo to its embassies around the world. And it was called the Purple Machine. It took us a year and a half to figure out, for our mathematicians in the U.S. Army to figure out how to break this code. Once they figured it out, the U.S. Navy made the machine for them. So it's a joint Army-Navy project. And so we called the diplomatic intelligence magic. That was the code name we gave it. And there was another code, which we'll get into later, called JN25, Japanese Navy 25, and that was the Japanese Navy's new operational code. And America spent a lot of time trying to break that code before Pearl Harbor with only limited success. The British spent a lot of time trying to break it with high success, which we'll get into later. So Roosevelt gets home for the conference, and so does Churchill, and they both read the following message. This is from the Japanese ambassador in Berlin back to Tokyo. And Hitler made this promise on August 15th. He said, quote, "In the event of a collision between Japan and the United States, Germany would at once open hostilities with America," end quote. Now, that's very important, because this tripartite pact between Japan, Italy, and Germany was only a defensive treaty. So basically what it said was, if America, it was a defensive treaty against the U.S., and the intent was, if America attacks Italy or Japan or Germany, the other two will jump in and help their partner fight America. What Hitler was saying to the Japanese ambassador was, if Japan ends up in a war with the U.S. for any reason, even if Japan starts the war, I will declare war and make war on America. When Roosevelt got back from this conference with Churchill, he suddenly had an ace up his sleeve. I mean, I'm sure he was astounded at this. Hitler was a big liar when it came to treaties and things he would say publicly, but he had been sharing his innermost secrets with the Japanese ambassador for years. And the promises that he made to Mussolini in private and to Japan in private were almost always kept. I mean, he was a man of his word with his two allies. With everyone else, he was very mendacious and deceitful. But so there was every reason to believe he was being truthful. And while Roosevelt certainly thought his primary road to getting into the war against Nazi Germany was fighting the U-boats in the Atlantic, he now had this thing in his hip pocket, this promise by Hitler made to the Japanese that if you go to war with America, I will too. Okay, now, Roosevelt did start convoying British ships with U.S. Navy escorts on September 16th, I believe it was. That's when the big convoy left Halifax on the way to England via Iceland. And, of course, the U.S. had said, we'll convoy the ships with our Navy as far as Iceland, and then you guys have to take over. But even before we started that, the first incident between the U.S. Navy and the U-boats took place on September 4th. September 4th, 1941, a U-boat fired 2 torpedoes at the USS Greer, a destroyer, and they missed. Roosevelt was a little bit distracted by the death of his mother at Hyde Park, but when the funeral was over, he went back to Washington and made a big speech on September 11th and really made a big deal out of this and called the German U-boats the rattlesnakes of the Atlantic. And what do you do with the rattlesnake? As soon as you see it, you kill it. And he basically, in so many words, said, we're going to keep the freedom of the seas open. We're going to keep supplies flowing to our moral ally, Great Britain. There was no, formal pact, but everybody knew by then that we were on their side. I mean, the whole world knew it. He said, we're going to keep the supplies flowing. We're going to keep the freedom of the seas open. We're going to confront armed force of the Axis at sea whenever we find it. And in so many words, he said, we're going to convoy. He never used the word convoy, but if you study the language of the speech, he used the Greer incident to justify the use of American warships to convoy British merchant ships. Even though he had made that deal in secret in mid-August, he used this incident to justify it. And said, we're going to attack these rattlesnakes in the future, wherever we see them. And in fact, the orders given to the U.S. Navy were to attack any U-boat within 200 miles. A lot of times they were on the surface. They'd be traveling on the surface at night or during the day there were no other ships in sight. So a lot of times airplanes would sight these things and then the ships could go after them. So he made a big speech.
That's incident number one, right?
Number one, and he even played a Star-Spangled Banner at the end of the radio address. And everybody in the room watching the radio speech stood up, put their hand over their heart. It was a big deal. Nobody cared. Nobody cared, Len. The American people remembered how we got into World War I. It was our outrage over unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany. And one of those things was the sinking of the liner Lusitania, but it was also the unrestricted warfare against any and all merchant ships. And that's what offended the American people so much in World War I. So people were very wary. So there was another incident, October 16th. The USS Kearney was another destroyer. This was hit by a torpedo. Several people were killed, and the ship barely made it back to port in Iceland. It almost sank. Roosevelt gave a big speech, an even bigger speech, on Navy Day on October 27th. And he was beating the drums of war, let me tell you. And I quoted both of these two speeches on September 11th and the October 27th in my book. They're very dramatic, and the American people didn't care. It didn't turn around public opinion. Most Americans, I'd say 4-1, did not want to fight Germany. And then there was a third incident on October 31st, just 4 days after this speech, and it was the worst one because the ship, the USS Reuben James, was sunk. All the officers were killed and 115 deaths, and you know what Roosevelt did? Nothing. No more attempt to persuade the public, no more sense of outrage, no more speeches. And I'm convinced that the reason he did nothing was he had already decided, okay, I'll get into the war another way. I have Hitler's secret promise. And, he and his Secretary of State and his government, they didn't like what Japan had been up to for years in the Far East, building an empire through brutal conquest. But they had been initially only engaged in deterrence against Japan. In other words, when Germany invaded France in 1940, Roosevelt made a major decision. He decided to keep the U.S. Pacific Fleet. At the time, it was just called the U.S. Fleet. This is before we had a two-ocean Navy. He decided to keep the U.S. Fleet in Hawaii after its exercises were over. The fleet was normally home-ported on the West Coast in San Diego and San Pedro. He decided to keep it there in May, as soon as Hitler invaded France, and as a deterrent against Japan. But gradually, starting in November 1940, his policy of deterring Japan turned into one of provocation. And there were probably three major milestones on the road to provocation of Japan. And I think I can tell you how it all began, and that is that an officer in the Office of Naval Intelligence, Commander Arthur McCollum, wrote a very provocative memo on October 7th, 1940. Now, the reason he wrote this memo is someone had asked O&I for a policy statement on what do we do about Japan. We got the war raging in Europe. What do we do about Japan? They're intent upon expanding through conquest. They want their own empire. They don't care what anybody thinks. What are we going to do about it? So he wrote a long memo the day before the commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet arrived in Washington to meet with Roosevelt. Now, this was Admiral Richardson, who already didn't get along with Roosevelt, who had already objected in July, he visited Roosevelt in July and said, the fleet shouldn't be in Pearl Harbor. It's too exposed. It doesn't have enough training facilities. There aren't enough repair facilities. And we don't have the supply train. We don't have enough auxiliary support ships to conduct a major offensive from Pearl Harbor. He says we shouldn't be there. And so Roosevelt told him, no, they're there for deterrence. I'm the president. You go back and do your job. So Richardson continued to complain. So on the second occasion, he was recalled to Washington for this meeting with Roosevelt. And the meeting was going to be on October 8th, and it was on October 8th. So the day before, McCollum writes this memo. What do we do about Japan? I'm going to read you the two key phrases which are really bellicose. The first one is, it is not believed that in the present state of political opinion, the United States government is capable of declaring war against Japan without more ado. It's barely possible that vigorous action on our part might lead the Japanese to modify their attitude. But we can't declare war without more ado. Therefore, we should take the following steps. He laid out a 8-point plan, and the three major points in his 8-point plan were keep the U.S. fleet in the Hawaiian Islands, insist that the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies refuse to grant Japanese demands for oil, and the biggest one of all, completely embargo, freeze all U.S. trade with Japan, in collaboration with a similar embargo imposed by the British. And everybody knew what that meant. That meant cut off their oil, because Japan got more than 90% of its oil from the United States. So at the end of his memo, he says, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better, end quote. So this is this memo from, although he's a mere commander, he's writing it to the director of Office of Naval Intelligence, and McCollum is one of the people, he's one of the 12 people on the magic distribution list, one of the 12 people that gets the diplomatic decoded messages. He's a major player in all this because he's the head of the Far East section in the Office of Naval Intelligence. And Roosevelt met every afternoon with naval officers. After his official political calls were over, 3 or 4 naval officers would usually be found in the White House. The director of O&I or the chief of war plans or the chief of naval operations, sometimes even Commander McCollum, or some of these couriers who were lieutenant commanders. So the very next day, Roosevelt meets with Richardson. And he's remarkably frank with Admiral Richardson, who wants the fleet to be taken away from Pearl. First, Roosevelt says, despite what you believe, I know that the presence of the fleet in the Hawaiian area has had and is now having a restraining influence on the actions of Japan. And Richardson sums up his long argument by saying, Mr. President, I still do not believe it, and I know that our fleet is disadvantageously disposed for preparing or initiating war. And basically, Richardson's argument was, we don't have enough auxiliary ships to conduct an offensive, we don't have enough oilers with the fleet, et cetera, not enough training facilities. So then Roosevelt, this is in his memoirs years later after the war, Richardson says, later I asked the president if we were going to enter the war. Now here's the response he wrote in his memoirs. This is what Roosevelt told Richardson on October 8th, 1940. Quote, he replied that if the Japanese attacked Thailand or the Kra Peninsula, that's Malaya, if the Japanese attacked Thailand or the Kra Peninsula or the Dutch East Indies, we would not enter the war. That if they even attacked the Philippines, he doubted whether we would enter the war, but that they could not always avoid making mistakes. And as the war continued and the area of operations expanded, sooner or later, they would make a mistake and we would enter the war, end quote. Now, this is Roosevelt in private to Richardson. And then Richardson makes a fatal mistake, and at the end of the interview he says, quote, Mr. President, I feel that I must tell you that the senior officers of the Navy do not have the trust and confidence in the civilian leadership of this country that is essential for the successful prosecution of a war in the Pacific. So Richardson ends up getting fired. He reads about it in the Kiplinger newsletter a couple of months later, and then he's relieved by Admiral Kimmel on February 1st, 1941. And there's a big Navy reorganization on that date. But so this is Roosevelt telling him the truth, that the American people aren't going to support war against to save the British or the Dutch colonies in the Far East, and they might not even want to go to war to support the Philippines. because that's a far away, out of sight, out of mind place for the United States. We'd already said they could have their independence after the war, in 1946, and so most people knew little or nothing about the Philippines and cared less. So Roosevelt knew that we were not going to go to war in the Far East to save anybody else, maybe not even to defend the Philippines, but that sooner or later the Japanese would make a mistake and we would enter the war. And that reveals the sly, patient, Machiavellian side of Roosevelt, what I call the chess player. Now, how about this for provocation? In February of 1941, Roosevelt meets with the Chief of Naval Operations, and he says, I want you to conduct pop-up cruises in or near Japanese territorial waters. And it was clearly in an attempt to provoke an incident with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, does that sound familiar? It ought to sound familiar because that's what he was intending to do in the Atlantic with the Germans later that year. Later in the autumn, he was trying to provoke incidents with U-boats. But this is back in February 41. So he wants these pop-up cruises. Now listen to this quote. Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark recorded what he said in a letter, and then it was later published in Stark's biography. This is what Roosevelt said at that meeting, quote, I just want them to keep popping up here and there and keep the Japs guessing. I don't mind losing 1 or 2 cruisers, but do not take a chance on losing 5 or 6, end quote. Now, to me, that's a very, very important quotation. I don't mind losing 1 or 2 cruisers, but don't lose 5 or 6. That's really, really interesting. That's when you couple that with what he told Richardson a few months before, which was sooner or later the Japs will make a mistake and will enter the war. It sounds like he's trying to stimulate the mistakes, but with pop-up cruises. And in fact, the worst one occurred, the most dangerous one occurred on July 31st, 41, where 2 U.S. Navy cruisers were at the entrance of the Bungo Strait, which is the entrance to Japan's inland sea, where most of their warships are tied up. And they were challenged at night. The U.S. Navy ships turned around, laid a smoke screen, and skedaddled out of there, and the Japanese filed a diplomatic protest. But that could have resulted in shooting. The U.S. ships were not lighted, they were darkened, and they were about to enter the most sensitive waterway into Japan's inland sea. So that's certainly a provocation. But the ultimate provocation, Len, and the one that led to the Pearl Harbor attack, was Roosevelt cutting off Japan's oil supply on July 26th, 1941. Now, why would Roosevelt do such a thing, particularly when his own Navy and his own Secretary of State were against embargoing Japan's oil? They knew that Japan got more than 90% of its oil from the United States. They knew that Japan was stockpiling oil, saving it up as fast as they could. And they knew that Japan was intent upon militaristic expansion all throughout Asia. Why would they, given that they've said don't embargo oil, don't cut off Japan's oil, why would Roosevelt want to do such a thing? Well, we know the answer. There's a professor named Waldo Heinrichs who wrote a great book called Threshold of War back in 1988, and he says Roosevelt's main priority, once Germany turned on the Soviet Union and stabbed them in the back on June 22nd, 1941, and tried to take all his land in the east that he wanted for German expansion, Roosevelt's main priority became keeping the USSR in the war, not letting them fold. So, here's what was going on that summer. We knew from our diplomatic decoding, we knew from the magic diplomatic intercepts that Japan was having an internal debate. And some of the Japanese, particularly in the army, wanted to attack Russia in the north, in Siberia, and defeat their old enemy from the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905. Other Japanese said, no, we want to expand to the south and take the British colonies in East Asia and the Dutch East Indies, which we now call Indonesia. So there was this debate going on, and Roosevelt, Professor Heinrichs is convinced, and so am I, the reason he cut off Japan's oil was to force them not to go north. If Japan had gone north in September or October 1941, it might have knocked the USSR out of the war or ensured their defeat by Hitler. Japan, once we cut off their oil, went into a panic, which was predicted by everyone. And in August, they secretly decided...
If you don't mind me cutting in, if anyone doesn't follow that, Japan attacking Russia, Soviet Union, would split their forces. They needed everything they could to hold the Eastern Front, and they almost fell.
They almost fell. And in fact, the German army in December 41 was at the suburbs of Moscow, at the capital, and had taken over everything west of that. And
and if Russia had to split and also counter incoming invaders from Japan, they would have fallen for sure.
That is true because, and we know that's true because in October 1941, Stalin figured out by his own means, he had his own spies in Japan, that Japan was not going to attack him, even though Japan was Russia's traditional enemy for the previous several decades. And what Stalin did is he transferred 1.5 million men from Siberia to the Moscow front. And if he had not done that in October, I'm sure the Germans would have taken Moscow. And that might have been it politically for Stalin. And so that means that Roosevelt's strategy with the oil embargo actually succeeded. It forced Japan not to go north and to go south. But of course, once Japan decided to go south, that they knew that they would have to fight Britain and the United States because they knew they were going to have to take the oil in the Dutch East Indies. Well, this is how the military mind works. We're going to have to take the oil in the Dutch East Indies and in British Borneo. To safeguard our lines of supply, the Japanese all said to each other, we have to take British Malaya and Singapore, or the oil we steal won't get home. It'll be sunk. And we also have to take the Philippines, they said, because that's on the other side of the supply line. The Philippines would be on the eastern side of their supply line back to Japan, and the Malaya and Singapore on the west. So they said, that means we're going to have to go to war with England and America. And they went one step further and said, well, gee, if we go to war with America, and these discussions went on for months, the Japanese all knew, without any exception, they could not win a long war with the United States. Their only chance of grabbing what they needed in the way of oil resources from the Dutch East Indies was to win a quick, sharp war with the United States, levy some serious defeats on us, and hope that we would sign a treaty with them after about a year and let them keep what they had. In other words, they hoped to defeat us in several initial battles and then hope we would just lose interest in the war and sign a peace treaty and let them keep what they took. So to make a very long story short, Admiral Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was the one and only person who said, we shouldn't wait. We shouldn't do what we've been planning to do for 30 years. We shouldn't wait for the American fleet to slog its way toward us. They would then have the initiative. He says, we should attack the American Pacific Fleet the day the war starts and cripple it so that we have 6 months to do what we have to do in Southeast Asia without interference, so that our southern operation can succeed unopposed, and then keep delivering defeats after that initial defeat until the Americans sue for peace. So he's the one that came up with the idea of attacking Pearl Harbor. The general staff of the Japanese Navy didn't like it. They thought it was a terrible risk of Japan's aircraft carriers, and it's acquired at great expense. There are 6 large aircraft carriers, and their naval aviators were the best trained in the world. At the time, we didn't know it, but at the time, their airplanes were the best in the world. The best fighter planes, the best torpedo bombers, and a very capable dive bomber.
Well, let's mention something also first here, that back then, the Navy didn't really make too much of aircraft carriers. It was about the battleship. And I think no one had really used more than 2 aircraft carriers in any exchange.
That's correct, Len.
So when you talk about the attack coming, and I don't want to get too premature, but it was totally unprecedented that 6 aircraft carriers would assemble and send. What did they send? 2 waves of 380 and 250 planes? Oh, no, 2 waves. Yeah, right?
2 waves of a total of 350, but 2 waves, and no one had ever put more than 2 carriers together in any task force before, and no one had ever used it as a blunt instrument of offense like that. The U.S. Navy was using carriers as screening and scouting forces for battleship task groups. There'd be like 1 carrier with 3 or 4 battleships. That was the way we wargamed everything. So to us, the aircraft carrier was not yet the primary tool of war, and nobody thought it would be except the aviators. But nobody listened to them back then. And of course, after the Pearl Harbor attack, the battleship became obsolete overnight, at least against air power. It was obsolete, and we had to turn our thinking on its head. And then the carrier became our primary offensive weapon. But prior to Pearl Harbor, it wasn't, and therefore we couldn't conceive of such a thing happening. Could not even conceive of it.
So what we have here is
So Yamamoto had this great plan, and he actually had to threaten to resign along with his entire staff unless the Navy General Staff adopted the plan. So they finally caved into him in October and adopted the plan. And but it was touch and go there for several months. And not only that, at the time, 99.99% of the people in the U.S. Navy said, nobody can launch torpedoes in Pearl Harbor. The water's too shallow, so we don't have to worry about torpedo bombers hitting our battleships. And they said the kind of bombs dropped by naval aircraft are not powerful enough and not heavy enough to penetrate the deck armor of battleships. So we don't have to worry about that either. If somebody dropped bombs on our battleships, there'd be some minor damage topside, but they wouldn't sink the ship, and it wouldn't blow the ship up. So both of those assumptions turned out to be wrong because, as we all know now, the Japanese developed special breakaway wooden fins for their torpedoes to help them run extremely shallow, so that instead of plunging to a depth of 75 feet or more, which was the normal procedure, most of them would not go into the mud and would survive in the Pearl Harbor waters, which are only, like 35, 40 feet deep. So, and then the Japanese took battleship shells, 16-inch battleship shells, 16 inches wide, and of course they're very long and heavier than an automobile. And they put special fins on them and turned battleship shells into special bombs designed specifically to penetrate the deck armor of battleships. And they practiced it over and over for months from an altitude of 10,000 feet. That's very high. And during the actual attack...
What they also had, they had a harbor that was very similar to Pearl Harbor. They had an ideal place to rehearse and practice these.
That was in Kyushu. That's right.
Right. So they knew exactly what they were going to do.
That's right. So of course, the hindsight is always 20/20, and hindsight is. And we're not going to spend too much time on that tonight.
Sure.
But the hindsight is that, of course, it was a psychological blunder of major proportions. It was a great tactical success, the attack, and
kind
strategically, it was a disaster.
Yeah, it was better than Japan had hoped for, and yet worse than Roosevelt ever dreamed of. But the worse it was, the better it was for his idea to unify the country. So just summarizing, we have this backdoor war, the 8-step plan, the oil embargo, Dutch East Indies, and then we have these pop-up cruise attacks, and you get to this idea of these codes, code breakers in Singapore. The English were breaking codes. That purple, J19, J25, I think it is also. Anyway,
Japanese Navy, JN25 is the word of the day. Yeah, so
there's military and diplomatic codes that are being read by America, and everyone seems to be telling them that Japan now is going to attack, and somehow America was saying, well, they're going to go south, they're going to go somewhere else. They would never dream of going to Pearl Harbor. Yet FDR is doing everything he can to leave this golden apple out for them to attack.
Yeah, and I tell you what, there's a famous quote that he makes the day before, I believe, he was informed by Churchill. And the famous quote is. Let's see here. Am I going to be able to find it? I hope so. I'll just do it from memory. On November 25th Roosevelt says at a cabinet meeting, it's recorded by the Secretary of War Stimson in his diary, that we all know that war is coming with Japan. It's just a matter of time. And the assumption by everybody, even on that day, the assumption by everybody was that it would be in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines. Was that the problem is that we have to maneuver them into firing the first shot without too much danger to ourselves, quote unquote. And so Stimson puts that in his diary. And by the way, he's been asking Roosevelt to go to war for 8 or 9 months against Germany. Roosevelt keeps saying, no. The American people aren't united. We can't do that. So the very next day, something very peculiar happens. And then I'm going to tell you what it was that was peculiar. And then I think then we need to talk about the code breaking and what it was that made Roosevelt turn his foreign policy with Japan on its head. So on November 26th, the United States was about to make a counteroffer to Japan, something called a modus vivendi, which was a way of living together. It's diplomatic talk, which in this case meant a 3-month delay in what appeared to be imminent hostilities between Japan and America. A 3-month delay in war, a way of living together for 3 months. What can we do to ease tensions and not fight each other for at least 3 months, maybe 6? And so Japan had made an offer along these lines on November 20th, and we were about to make our counteroffer. And to make a long story short, the gist of it was that, of our counteroffer was, you withdraw all of your troops from South Vietnam and Cambodia, which, by the way, Japan had moved into forcefully the previous July. That was the on the surface, that was the stimulus for the oil embargo. But and the year before they had gone into North Vietnam. So remove all your troops from South Vietnam. If you do that and you don't launch any offensive attacks in Asia against anybody, we will sell you a small amount of oil for domestic consumption, not for the military, just for domestic use at home. And those were the basic, and no mention was made of China. China was the big stumbling block between Japan and the United States. China had been at war in Japan for 4 years. They had been raping the country, occupied large portions. They thought it was their destiny to rule Asia by force, and they couldn't extricate themselves from that war. They couldn't win the war, and they also couldn't get out. It would have been too much of a loss of face. So they were stuck like a fly to flypaper in China. We wanted them out, and there was a total impasse on that. So the modus vivendi avoided talking about China. Let's just get along for 3 more months. And this made the American military happy. It gave us 3 more months to reinforce the Far East, send some more B-17 bombers out there, and maybe some more weapons. Gave the British more time to send reinforcements to the Far East. And then suddenly on the 26th of November, Roosevelt flipped overnight. And that's the mystery of my book and of his entire foreign policy that year, is he flipped overnight, and instead of sending this accommodating message to Japan, why can't we just get along for 3 more months, he sent an ultimatum that he knew they could not accept, and which ensured, I'll explain why I say that in a minute, ensured they would attack the United States. And the question is, why did he do this? Why did he flip his policy overnight and send an ultimatum? And this is the part of the story that's nuanced a little bit. And everybody loves smoking guns. They're always looking for smoking guns. And there is no ultimate smoking gun in this case, but I think we've got pretty close to it in my book. But what happened was he sent, instead of the modus vivendi, he ordered the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, to send what was called the Hull Note, which was 10 very, very tough, and the Japanese didn't expect this, very, very tough demands. One of them was that Japan, now listen to this, would withdraw all military, naval, and air and police forces from China and Indochina. Wow, including China, not just from South and North Vietnam, but from China. Withdraw all your troops from China. That Japan would only recognize the Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek, which was their enemy. He was the head of the nationalist Chinese government. and that Japan would engage in signing a treaty protecting the territorial integrity of French Indochina, which was North and South Vietnam and Cambodia. And so there were many more points, but these were the main ones, and it was completely unacceptable, and we knew it when we sent it. And in fact, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who had opposed the oil embargo in the first place, was called over to the White House the morning of the 26th and came back in a rage 15 minutes later, and one of his aides wrote down what he said. He said, quote, "Those men over there do not believe me when I tell them the Japanese will attack us. You cannot give an ultimatum to a powerful and proud people and not expect them to react violently," end quote. So he was not happy about it, but he delivered the ultimatum. It had been floating around in draft form since about November 17th, but until that morning, we had no intention of delivering it. Now, Cordell Hull said in his memoirs that it was his idea to change the policy overnight. That's not believable. Nobody believes that. He wanted the modus vivendi. He worked hard for it. And initially, Roosevelt supported the modus vivendi. Another speculation, I call it, by mainstream historians on why Roosevelt flipped our foreign policy on its head and why did he send Japan an ultimatum was that Churchill didn't like the modus vivendi, and he thought it was a little bit cruel to Chiang Kai-shek. Well, when you look into it, it turns out he did ask Roosevelt in a message, "Is not Chiang Kai-shek having a thin diet?" But that's all he said. He also told his foreign secretary, Anthony Eden, "Let's let the Americans do what they want. The last thing we want is another war. We've got plenty of war in Europe. We don't need another one in Japan. So go ahead and tell the Americans, we're going to tell them, go ahead with your modus vivendi." So this suggestion that Chiang Kai-shek was having a thin diet was not a very strong objection. They still gave us lukewarm support for our modus. So that explanation doesn't hold up. And the only other explanation for why he changed his foreign policy overnight was a diary entry by Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, in which he claims that he told Roosevelt, "Did you get that morning on the phone, did you get the memo I wrote yesterday?" And reportedly Roosevelt said no. And it was supposedly about 30 or 40 or 50 Japanese ships heading south toward Malaya. And that reportedly, when he told Roosevelt on the phone, he literally jumped up in the air and got all excited and said, "This proves how dishonest they are," and got upset. But the more historians have looked into that, it doesn't hold water. The actual memo that Stimson sent to Roosevelt only talked about 10 or 20 or 30 ships, not 30, 40, or 50, and it didn't talk about them being at sea. It said they were on the Yangtze River moving south. It was kind of an ordinary troop movement. Plus, Roosevelt apparently really did read the memo the day before. So, therefore, there's no explanation that makes sense for Roosevelt sending an ultimatum to Japan that he knew was an ultimatum until you start looking at two Japanese naval messages that I believe the British decoded. These are JN-25 messages, which I believe they decrypted and then sent the contents of one or both to Franklin Roosevelt such that he received the contents either late on the 25th of November, late that night, or early the next morning on the 26th. And this is my contribution to this backdoor to war debate. I think I've found the actual message, Len, that explains why Roosevelt would suddenly send an ultimatum to Japan. It's been in plain sight. It's been hiding in plain sight since 1946. The message was published in the Joint Congressional Committee report, the committee that looked into the Pearl Harbor attack. It's published in their report, but the trouble is their report was 40 volumes. You think the Warren Commission is long. This thing was one volume of the basic report and 39 supporting volumes of evidence and testimony. So buried in there was this message, and it's in another publication that year, published by the U.S. Army, called Campaigns of the Pacific War, which was the result of all their interrogations of the Japanese Navy immediately after the war ended. So here's the text of this message, which was sent on November 22nd. How about that date? November 22nd, 1941. Here it is. Quote, this is from Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, to the 6 aircraft carriers and their supporting warships. that's called the First Air Fleet. So this is Yamamoto to the First Air Fleet, November 22nd. He says, quote, "The task force keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining a close guard against submarines and aircraft shall advance into Hawaiian waters and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet in Hawaii and deal it a mortal blow." And then he says the exact date will be announced later. Then at the end, he actually tells the fleet, you're going to turn around. If negotiations are successful, you will not attack. You will turn around and come home. And these are the exact words. Quote, "Should the negotiations with the United States prove successful, the task force shall hold itself in readiness forthwith to return and reassemble." End quote. So this is one heck of a message. And I'll tell you, there's one other one sent 3 days later on November 25th. This is from Yamamoto to the First Air Fleet. And he's basically telling them to get underway from their secret rendezvous north of Japan and travel directly east, which there's only one thing in the way, and that's Hawaii. So he says, "The task force, keeping its movement strictly secret, shall leave Hitokapu Bay on the morning of 26th November and advance to," and he gives a longitude and latitude, which is halfway to Hawaii. And you'll go to that position and refuel on the afternoon of 3 December. So one of these two messages, possibly both, I think, were decoded by the British in Singapore, especially the first one. This gave the code breakers time to decode this thing. Sometimes decoding took several hours. Sometimes it took a day or a day and a half. It gave them a couple of days to decode it, another day to transmit it to London, and another day for London and Churchill to receive the information and to act on it. And so I think the first message, the one that says, turn around and come home if the negotiations are successful, that almost has to be the message that Roosevelt received, because he made sure with his ultimatum that the negotiations were not going to be successful.
Right. It would have scared the hell out of him. He says, oh, this is exactly what I don't want to happen.
Yeah, and yeah, that's right. It would have scared Roosevelt. And of course, the Japanese, the samurai warriors in the Japanese Navy, they didn't want to turn around anyway. So they were hoping the negotiations would fail. There were very few people in Japan, a couple of timid diplomats that wanted negotiations to succeed, but nobody in the military at this point did.
And so also we should make mention of something else. The reason Churchill and the code breakers in Singapore are passing these on because Churchill knows that if America is attacked, with this
that Hitler will declare war on America.
Right. And
because
and
they both have the magic machine.
Right.
That's right.
There won't be the 3-month debate. There won't be anything. And so
that's right.
Churchill needs to get this message to Roosevelt and then let him know the attack is coming. And then, Roosevelt does everything he can to make sure that happens by sabotaging any kind of negotiations and furthermore insulting them, saying,
That's right. So, and of course, in the Japanese culture, faces everything. So, the three provocations after Roosevelt engaged in deterrence, put the fleet in Pearl Harbor to try to stop Japanese expansion just by a fleet in being. The three provocations were the pop-up cruises, then the oil embargo, that was the big one, but then the coup de grace was the ultimatum on the 26th.
Seizing Japanese assets in America, right?
Well, they're all one and the same, and that's what's so interesting about this. The official word given out to the media by the Roosevelt administration is that it's a freeze on Japanese assets, and that all Japanese funds have been frozen, and they can't do anything here. It's an oil embargo without calling it an oil embargo, but it was very clear to the Japanese very quickly that there was not going to be any more oil, and that he was so clever in what he did and the way he did it that he's imposed an oil embargo without even saying so.
Right.
Which is kind of remarkable.
Well, your book, I mean, you have to get the book, I guess, to go through all the deals, but just to summarize it, we know now that Roosevelt and Churchill were both looking for an incident. They weren't looking for Congress to vote or a resolution or anything. They were looking for an incident
that would cause that would either cause another nation to declare war on us, or that would cause the American people to be so angry that we would declare war on somebody else in a fit of rage. And
right, and because of these code breakers, they knew that if we can't declare war on Germany, but if Japan attacks us, and we can't fire the first shot, that's something else that can't be understated.
Right, that's the policy announced by Roosevelt in the cabinet meeting on the 25th, the day before. And it gets even more strident. I mean, there were 3 war warning messages sent by the U.S. military to everyone in the Pacific. 2 of them were sent on the 27th of November, the day after this foreign policy flip, and 1 was sent by the Navy the 28th. And all 3 had the key language in it: if war is unavoidable, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act, end quote. The first overt act. That's almost a direct quote of Commander McCollum's memo from the previous October, where he says, if Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. So now we're using the word first overt act in messages to all the Pacific commanders. And
so we know this now because of the revelations of these code breakers that from British code breaking of Purple, JM25, all this. I mean, I think that the number is I think I've got it from your book here, over 26,000 intercepts, 26,000, and later on I think they say 188 of them had to do with Pearl Harbor itself. But they knew what was happening. They knew.
Yeah, let's talk about this. Yeah, let's talk about what the U.S. government says and what's believable and what's not. First of all, as my book details, you know it, Len, there were many code breakers from the Far East in the British organization in Singapore who remembered sending warnings to London and to Churchill about this forthcoming attack, and recommending that, of course, that the Americans be informed. And they always assumed that he would inform the Americans. And I believe he did, too. It would have been the folly on his part not to let us know, especially since he knew it would bring the U.S. into the war against Hitler. So we know from a top-secret report written in 1946 by the U.S. Navy, but withheld from Congress. They prepared this report in case Congress started asking about JN-25. Congress didn't, so the report remained classified. But in 1991, it was declassified. And this report said, now listen to this, folks, over a 3-month period only, between September and December 1941, the U.S. Navy listening posts and intercept sites all over the Pacific intercepted over 26,000 Japanese Navy messages. These are radio men with earphones on, typing down the Morse code, the Japanese version of the Morse code, symbol by symbol, and sending them on to Washington. And some of them went to the Philippines at our code-breaking station there, and some went to Hawaii, some went to Washington. And this study that the U.S. Navy conducted after World War II was over. That's the part they want us to believe that I find hard to believe. But anyway, they claim, the U.S. Navy claims, we did not decode any of the Pearl Harbor related messages until after the war ended. I don't find that worthy of belief. But anyway, that's what this report says. It says we didn't decrypt any of them until after the war was over, in the autumn of 45 and early in 46. And then of the 26,000 that we intercepted over those 3 months, about 2,000 of them were of high interest. And of those 2,000 messages, 188 of them had to do with Pearl Harbor. And if someone, they said in 1946 in this report, they said if someone had been able to decrypt all 188 messages, they could have assembled the puzzle and figured out what was coming toward Pearl Harbor. Now, here's the part of the story where it gets fuzzy, and you have to decide. Am I going to believe authority, or am I going to use my common sense and engage in critical thinking? These people claim not to have intercepted this key message of November 22nd, telling the Japanese First Air Fleet to attack the U.S. fleet in Hawaii and to turn around and come home if the negotiations succeed. And they claim not to have intercepted the sailing order, which told them to refuel at a point halfway to Hawaii. And it said what the underway date was, too, November 26th. I don't find that credible that they didn't intercept them. If you intercepted 26,000 and several hundred messages over 3 months, why is it these two that you're going to miss? I don't buy it. And I also don't believe that the U.S. Navy waited until after the surrender was signed in 1945 to decode the messages from November 1941. I just don't believe it. I think we know a cover-up was conducted. Many people recall the post-Pearl Harbor cover-up in the Navy Communications Headquarters. And I believe that what they did is destroyed all the worksheets they had and kept 98% of the intercepts or more. They just kept the intercepts, put them away. We know what happened now. We're embarrassed as hell. We're not going to admit it to anybody. Put the intercepts away, lock them up till the war's over, destroy all the decrypts. Now, here's the real story. The British code breakers were more than 1 year ahead of the U.S. Navy in breaking the JN-25 code. They were more than 1 year ahead of us. And all of the anecdotal accounts that we had in the 70s and 80s from their surviving code breakers when they became brave enough to talk was that, yes, we knew this was happening and we warned London. And there were people in London that remember being told, have we warned our American cousins? Oh, yes, they know all about it. So they say they broke the messages and that London was warned. Churchill and England were totally dependent on Canada and America for survival, for their food and for their weapons, particularly on the United States for their weapons. So for the weapons to stay in the war, of course, Great Britain was making as many weapons as they could, especially airplanes, as fast as they could, but I think we provided something like 1/5 of all the material they used during the war. That's a lot. That's an extra 20%. So I think the U.S. Navy, by the way, we haven't said this to the audience, the head of the Navy code-breaking effort that was trying to break JN-25 had his best people working on the wrong code. Captain Safford had his people working on the flag officer's code, not on JN-25. He had the Philippine outfit working on JN-25. The outfit in Hawaii wasn't allowed. After the war started, he allowed the Hawaii unit to start working on JN-25, and then 3 days after the Japanese admiral who attacked Pearl, Admiral Nagumo, 3 days after he sent his damage report, these are the ships I sank at Pearl Harbor, the Hawaii office head, Hypo, had decoded that message. The message was sent the 16th, and by 19 November they had decoded it. So that's a tragedy in itself that we bet our money on the wrong code, basically. But excuse me.
Well, I wonder if these guys were, told, oh, forget about that code, go to this one, this is more important.
It's part of the mystery. We don't know. I mean, we just don't know. We know that Hawaii, the Hypo office, they begged to work on JN-25, and they weren't allowed.
Weren't allowed.
So, it's really interesting. So
I want to get to one thing, though. When you talk about that people knew, code breakers knew, they said pass them on to our American cousins, there is a talk that Churchill called the White House to say they're coming. Now, we can discuss that in a minute, but it's also backed up here by, if you read it, that a lot of shipping was coming north of Hawaii. And suddenly, strangely, all the shipping is ordered to go south. And this is, if you're going to Australia and Indonesia, if you were going anywhere else, you would never take this route. But all shipping ordered to the Torres Strait, right between, well, it's between there, Australia and Indonesia. But you would never go that way. So it's as if they said, we don't want anyone to find by mistake discover this big fleet coming here. And I mean, you can't think that that's not so. When you hear people saying, well, we did warn America, and what's your thought on Churchill actually calling the White House to say they're coming?
Well, I'm tormented about what to believe. In my book, I published this very controversial transcript which the person who provided it claims that it's one of the transatlantic telephone calls between Roosevelt and Churchill that they claim it was intercepted by the Germans, and then there's a transcript, which is 95% in English, 5% in German, and it's very provocative, and it has the phone call actually happening the morning of November 26th, oddly enough. And it actually sounds, to me, it sounds like the way those men spoke. It sounds like Churchill's diction, and it sounds like Roosevelt's old-fashioned speech. The problem is the document didn't come from an official archive. It was published in a book called Gestapo Chief in 1995, and supposedly was taken out of Germany by an SS general. And then by various means, the story kept changing, given to an historian. So the problem is it doesn't come from an archive, and then the German technician in charge of that decoding effort, the one who broke the transatlantic telephone calls, said that, the Americans changed their equipment. They changed the frequencies they were using, and there was a 6-month period when we couldn't decode any of the telephone calls. And it appears that this call probably would have been within the blackout period. So there's more than one reason to believe that this document probably is a very clever forgery. But the book isn't totally in. I mean, I don't know. Here's what I do know. There was a secret circuit that existed in New York City, from New York City to London, by underwater cable, that allowed, by the way, the transatlantic telephone calls actually went by radio. It was a scrambled radio message by voice, and then it would get descrambled at the other end. There was an underwater cable for coded cablegrams that went from London to New York City, and it terminated in the office of the #1 British propaganda agent in America. So a famous Canadian, William Stevenson, the code name of his office was Intrepid, and of course later he wrote a book, The Man Called Intrepid. He called himself Intrepid after the war. There was a secret way to communicate between Roosevelt and Churchill through his office, where there would be no records kept in the U.S. State Department or in the British Foreign Ministry. It was a way of sending sensitive messages without anything being in the record books. And we know that day, oh, by the way, it's called the British Security Coordination Office, BSC. It was the British purchasing office in the United States for all the war material they wanted. And Stevenson's other job, the one that was kind of under the table, was to get America into the war by hook or crook. That was his main task. So on this day when Roosevelt sent the ultimatum, he sent his son up to New York City late on November 26th with a message to Churchill using this secret circuit from the BSC office in Rockefeller Plaza to London. And the message said, quote, "Negotiations off. Services expect action within 2 weeks," end quote. So we're no longer negotiating, and the military services expect a war within 2 weeks. That's what it said. And the reason we know this was sent is that office wrote an internal history in 1943, and then that internal history was used to write a book by someone in 1962. So then this message from Roosevelt via his son, Colonel James Roosevelt, back to Churchill, was made public in 1962. And John Costello, a British historian, he's now deceased, but before he wrote his book in 1994 called Days of Infamy, he contacted Stevenson personally. Stevenson was still alive, and confirmed that this message was really sent back in the other direction. So what Costello believes and what I believe is that this message sounds to us like it's a reply to something that came in earlier. It sounds to us like it's a reply to maybe something that FDR received from Churchill over that same circuit, perhaps the previous evening. So, and then a number of authors, in particular John Costello in his book Days of Infamy, and Russ Bridger and Nave in their book Betrayal at Pearl Harbor, they have both talked about the fact that they believed in the early 90s when they wrote their books that Churchill was shown decrypted messages, signals intelligence, on November 25th. That's now missing. At the time they wrote their books, let me take that back. At the time they wrote their books, it was suppressed, and they weren't allowed to see some of the messages he saw that day that were sent to him by the head of MI6. His nickname was C, Stuart Menzies. So I did my own investigation. I got to run around between the British National Archives and the British version of the NSA called GCHQ, General Communications Headquarters, both pointing fingers at each other. GCHQ, the British NSA, telling me, "Oh no, we gave up all those types of messages to the archives in 1993," something like that. The archives saying, "Well, we don't have the messages you're looking for. Some of the serial numbers that I asked about, that these other authors referenced, we don't have some of those. But if we don't have them, it means that GCHQ destroyed them." And then I would go back to GCHQ, and their historian would tell me, "Oh no, we don't hold anything now, and we didn't destroy anything. We give everything to the archives." The archives told me twice the things that I believed were missing. I quoted certain serial numbers. It's very complex. I wrote about it in my book at length. They said they're either still held by GCHQ or they were destroyed by GCHQ. So I got two organizations pointing fingers at each other. So there's still a mystery here, which may never be resolved. And that mystery is what are the decrypted messages that Churchill saw on November 25th? Some of them have been released, and some of them appear innocuous. They don't appear to be related to the two messages I read on the air tonight. But there are 5 or 6 other serial numbers that are unaccounted for, to make a long story short. So there's a mystery there. And, either that transatlantic phone call did take place, which I reluctantly concluded in my book that it's probably a clever forgery, because there was a big paper written about less than 10 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, in which the people doing the analysis concluded that it was probably a clever forgery, and it was probably sent during the blackout period, and it didn't come from an official archive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that one message I read you, the first one, would have provided the information that was in that purported telephone call. So,
well, you remember the Dan Rather problems where they said here's this records about George Bush,
yes,
but that font wasn't used then, so they totally discredit the note. But yet, all they've got to do is rewrite it and make it a forgery, and then people just say, "Oh, it's not true," and leave it alone. For here, I think that a similar thing can happen, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of smoke here. At the time, the Germans weren't recording their intercepted telephone calls in English either. At the time, they were recording them in German. So one of the questions in the analysis was, why isn't this in German if it's authentic? And the only answer to that might make sense at all is that if someone secretly copied it later, and that's how he squirreled the thing out of the country. I mean, I don't know. But even if that transatlantic telephone call transcript is a clever forgery, I still believe Churchill did notify Roosevelt, and I believe that what we have through this book published in 1962 is the evidence of Roosevelt's reply to a message he received from Churchill. One way or another, he received the information from Churchill. Now, there's some really titillating information that things did come in on the 26th. I'll just like to go into 2 of them if I can.
Go ahead.
And maybe we can end up by, I'd like to read some testimony of General Marshall that he made in front of Congress and Secretary of War Stimson, because it's pretty damning testimony. Maybe we can end up with that. But here's some of the evidence that something did come in on the 26th. The Army Pearl Harbor Board wrote a top-secret report in 1944 and said, quote, on November 26th, there was received specific evidence of Japanese intentions to wage war against Great Britain and the U.S., end quote. So at the same time the Army Pearl Harbor Board was in session, the Navy Court of Inquiry was in session, looking into poor Admiral Kimmel in Pearl Harbor and what happened to him. Basically, Kimmel and General Short, the Army commander on the island, they were both accused of dereliction of duty by the Roosevelt administration, by Justice Roberts, and he did the first investigation, and they were trying to clear their names. So on July 24th, 1944, Admiral Kimmel was allowed to personally question the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stark, who was Chief of Naval Operations when Pearl Harbor happened. He was Roosevelt's man, running the Navy for Roosevelt, including the pop-up cruises. And he asked him, under oath, quote, Kimmel asked, quote, do you recall whether on or about 26 November you received office information from the ONI that it had specific evidence of Japan's intention to wage an offensive war against Great Britain and the United States? So Kimmel's taking this question, this data point raised by the Army in its own investigation, and he's asking Admiral Stark, did you receive such information? And Stark, listen to this. This is the Navy Court of Inquiry transcript of his answer. Quote, the witness, Admiral Stark, stated that to answer the question would involve the disclosure of information detrimental to the public interest, and that he claimed his privilege against revealing state secrets. The court announced that the witness's claim of privilege to this question was honored and that he need not answer the question, end quote, end quote. Well, that's pretty provocative. He claimed the old national security excuse before we ever heard it in the 60s, okay? So then, also in 1944, the Army Pearl Harbor Board was grilling General Marshall, saying, why did you send out two different war warnings to your Pacific commanders on November 27th? And you might have expected Marshall to say something like, well, we sent Japan an ultimatum the day before, and so we thought war might be the result. But no, that's not what he said. He said, quote, I think the message, that's his war warnings, I think the message was based on something that came in on the 26th, I rather imagine. But I have no clear recollection. So he doesn't say it was the Hull note. He says something came in on the 26th. So then about a year later, December 1945, the war is over. The Congressional Committee is point blank asking General Marshall, were you receiving intelligence other than the magic, other than the diplomatic messages that the U.S. and Britain were breaking? Were you receiving messages of that nature from Great Britain during the war? And he says yes. And he says, but early in the war, they wouldn't send us verbatim information. They would send us summaries. But he said, yes, we were. And then they said, well, we never heard about this. And he says, quote, I am quite certain that would not be in your record, sir, because we've been trying to keep that quiet as much as we could, end quote. So this is Marshall trying to keep the JN-25 code-breaking secret even after the war is over. It's really interesting. So, what I see happening here is a President Roosevelt who recognizes the wanton cruelty and brutality of the Axis nations, particularly Nazi Germany, and believes wholeheartedly the U.S. is going to have to become involved in order to stop that country, and is doing all he can to educate the American people, even up to creating incidents in the Atlantic to try to get us into the war, and none of those things worked. All he had left up his sleeve by November 1941 was this backdoor to war, this promise Hitler had made to Japan. And what's interesting is that the Japanese in Tokyo asked, is this promise still good? They asked in late November, and on December 1st, the Japanese ambassador in Berlin said, yes, I've just asked the foreign minister, and the promise is still good. And we were reading that. So look, a lot of people in your audience may not know that there was a man in Washington called Captain Raneft. He was a Dutch naval attaché in Washington. And he made two key diary entries in December 1941, which, if you believe his diary, they prove that the Office of Naval Intelligence knew that Japanese warships were headed for Hawaii. On December the 2nd, his diary entry reads, meeting at the Navy Department, the location of two Japanese carriers leaving Japan with eastern course are pointed out to me on the map, end quote. So that's a pretty short entry, but the important thing is Japanese aircraft carriers, the number is wrong. He thinks I think it's only two. That's what he puts in his diary, but it's Japanese carriers heading east. The only thing east is the Hawaiian Islands. All the other Japanese ships are going south towards Southeast Asia. Then on December 6th, the day before Pearl Harbor, this is the humdinger. He says, Saturday, December 6th, 1941, at 1400, that's 2 p.m., to the Navy Department. The department is closed except for the division of O&I, where a night watch is kept. Everyone is present at O&I. He proceeds to name who was there, including the director of O&I and Commander McCollum. He says, at my request, they show me the location of the 2 carriers west of Honolulu on the chart. I ask, what is the meaning of these carriers at this location? Whereupon I receive an answer that it's probably in connection with Japanese future action. Then he says, no one among us mentions the possibility of an attack on Honolulu. I myself do not think about it because I believe everyone at Honolulu is 100% on the alert, just like everyone here at ONI. So this guy published his diary of his 7 years in Washington in 1952. The translations have been confirmed by The Hague, by the Dutch Ministry of Defense. So the astute listener might then ask, well, how did O&I know that there were carriers heading across the Pacific? Because the U.S. Navy listening posts were also radio direction finding stations. And if you are at a radio direction finding station, you're not only intercepting messages and sending them to Washington on the teletype, but you're recording what direction did that radio message come from. So between November 30th and December 4th, the radio direction finding stations all over the Pacific, 2 of them in Alaska, 1 in Seattle, and there were 3 in California, I think. Various stations were reporting lines of bearing on Japanese transmissions. And when the lines were plotted, they intercepted to show ships moving across the North Pacific between November 30th and December 4th. And Robert Stinnett, in his book Day of Deceit, takes these original reports from John Toland in his book Infamy in the 1980s, and he expands the story, interviews the people over again, publishes their names, and basically the people in San Francisco, the Navy intelligence officers for this 5-day period, were aware of Japanese warships moving across the North Pacific east and, in the direction of the Hawaiian Islands. And they reported all this to Washington, and this is how O&I could plot the position on the chart.
This is another, I don't know if it's folklore, but a lot of people, the folklore is that how did they get away with such a surprise attack? And they said that the Japanese fleet kept strict radio silence. But I've heard...
Right, I believe that's a myth that's no longer worthy of belief.
Right, so they didn't keep radio silence, although they were sending coded messages, these directional things. And, one thing, Fletcher made a comment to me one day about ONI. He said, everybody talks about the CIA. He said, the ONI is much larger than the CIA. So if you think you're studying intelligence, wait till you start looking into the ONI. I haven't even,
wow.
He just thought that there was much larger in scope. ONI, and with a lot.
That's fascinating. I never heard that Fletcher Prouty quote before. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So look,
I want to summarize a few things because I know we're running out of time, but I don't want to exactly run out of time. I really was impressed by finding out that the shipping routes were changed.
I'm sorry, I forgot to comment on that. There was a vacancy order, Len, issued by the U.S. Navy on November 26th. How about that? That's the same day the Japanese fleet sailed.
Yeah.
So we issued a vacancy order that all trans-Pacific shipping is to be routed by the Navy down between Australia and New Guinea. That's all the way to the south of the globe. And it's remarkable that it just happened to clear the path.
Yeah, military and domestic, right? That's the quote I have, military and domestic shipping?
It was all merchant shipping.
Right.
And in fact, there was only one exercise going on by the U.S. Navy. It was north of Hawaii, exactly where the Pearl Harbor attack was launched from a week later. And when the Navy war warning, one of the Navy war warnings went out on November 24th, one of their many warnings, it said, do not make any provocative actions against Japan. So as soon as Admiral Kimmel got that message, he canceled his exercise, which was supposed to go on for another 2 days, and brought the fleet home immediately. And once he canceled that exercise, there was no shipping in the North Pacific except Japanese.
Yeah, can you imagine that? That's like a famous stand-down order, what we've heard in other instances. Yeah. Secondly, starting, I think, in September, Japan had intelligence on Pearl Harbor They had people sending reports, and we knew about that. So they're
That's right.
plotting
And
a grid.
It's really damning that the chief of naval war plans, I might as well say it, a real bastard, Richmond K. Turner. He was called Terrible Turner, a screaming, shouting, alcoholic madman who wanted to be chief of naval operations. He was chief of naval war plans at this time, and considered himself superior to the Office of Naval Intelligence. He was supposed to be co-equal, but he basically took over and rode roughshod over 3 O&I directors in a row and controlled everything they did or didn't send. All their analyses went through him. They had to agree with what he wanted to say. And he is the person when, here's what happened. Yeah, in September, the Tokyo Foreign Ministry, on behalf of the Navy, asked its consulate in Honolulu, start reporting regularly on where the American Navy ships tie up in Pearl Harbor. We want to know specific locations by ship type. And so this was a lower-level diplomatic code called J-19, and it wasn't decoded in Washington until like October 9th, I think. And once it was decoded, the people in the Navy and the Army knew this. Oh my God, look at this. This is a big deal. And so they called it the bomb plot message. And so the one person who refused to allow the Hawaiian commander, Admiral Kimmel, to be notified in Hawaii was Admiral Turner, the chief of naval war plans, who also rode roughshod over O&I. He refused to allow the O&I director and one of his department heads to notify Hawaii, and they argued with him, and they were summarily transferred the next day. And this happened in October 41. So among those who probably knew this was coming and knew Roosevelt's strategy of let the Japanese strike first, let the blow fall to unite the country, one of them was almost certainly, Richmond K. Turner. And I would have to include at this point George Marshall and Admiral Stark. And I, in great detail, go into the book on why I say that about General Marshall and Admiral Stark, and basically they admitted it with their own testimony to Congress in so many words.
Right. So this is people who kept magic information from Hawaii. I mean,
right.
This is what years later you'll find out if you study Kimmel and his relatives that gone on to clear his name. That
right.
They said, how is it that you could have had so much information on this? I mean, it's really incomprehensible that this is a surprise attack in a day of infamy. I mean, even coming down to the speech. I mean, usually it takes a little while to prepare a speech, something like that he gave the next day.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to, so who kept? I'm just checking off questions I've got. And then my next question is, since we know from these records that Pearl Harbor was being scouted, several times a week, is that correct? I hesitate to say daily. But
initially, they said regular reports, and he would send them roughly once a week. And then toward the end, about a week before the attack, they said, we want you to send reports twice a week. And he was sending reports twice a week, and then the last few days, one per day.
Okay, right. So this is the kind of reports that they know. Something's up, right?
Yeah.
So then I got a question for you, which you may or may not be able to answer, because I'm not sure how much you address. I mean, there's a heavy reading for me, but we got to talk about 3 aircraft carriers, Lexington, Saratoga, Enterprise, that then were out of there. I mean, if there was ever a prize and you wanted to cripple America, these aircraft carriers were around there. And do you have an opinion or any information on how it is that they were out?
I'll lay out the points of the mystery for the audience, and everybody's going to have to make their own decision.
Or get your book and read
it. I used to be really suspicious that the carriers were not in port when Pearl Harbor was attacked, because they were Admiral Yamamoto's prime targets. The battleships were his secondary targets. On the 26th of November, Len, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stark, sent a message to Hawaii and said, I want you to take fighter planes to Wake and Midway. And actually they wanted to send half the Army fighter planes on the island, which didn't make sense either. Let's strip half our defense and send it to Wake and Midway. And Kimmel got together with Short in Hawaii, and they decided, well, we can't send Army fighter planes on Navy carriers that they wouldn't be able to take off. The carriers wouldn't be able to defend themselves. So we'll send Marine Corps fighters. They know how to take off from aircraft carriers. So anyway, the Saratoga was in the shipyard on the West Coast, but the two carriers that were operational that were in Pearl were the Lexington and the Enterprise. And they got underway on different days, but they were both out and not in port delivering these fighter planes. Now, you can say that's really suspicious, or you can just say the Americans got really lucky. I'm beginning to think they got lucky because the Enterprise was due back in that morning. She was due back in port at 8 o'clock and was delayed by bad weather. And so she ended up entering, at the end of the day at sunset. So if she had been back on time, she would have been destroyed. And, the American carriers are lucky they didn't run into the Japanese fleet because they had the best trained airmen in the world and 6 large fleet carriers used to conducting coordinated air operations with each other. They would have been toast if they'd located the Japanese. But they're lucky. Yes, they're very lucky they weren't in port. But as in so many other things, like the vacant sea order, the timing is really suspicious. It's 26 November again.
Well, yeah,
so many things.
And it's also it reminds me of kind of like a stand down order. You're not needed here.
In Dallas, yeah.
So we're not really needed in Pearl Harbor. We've got somewhere else for you to be. And
it's really interesting. And
when you think about it that way, and then another item here that really should be discussed was that you mentioned the fact that no one ever dreamed that these low depth torpedoes could be launched. I mean, they would go down to 70 feet, and then they level out. Where there is I shouldn't say well documented, but the Office of ONI knew of, I think, a year earlier in a big
the naval attaché report of the British attack at Taranto. Yes. Uh-huh.
Taranto, Taranto in Italy, where they dropped these torpedoes to a depth of possibly 24 feet, and they just skimmed. Before, they used to fly quite high. I'll pick a number.
That was the problem. All these airplanes were flying too high, so of course they would plunge 75 feet. And the British learned how to fly really low, and so did the Japanese. Right.
10, 20 feet off the water, just drop them in. They dip down to 20 feet or 24 feet is the minimum, I guess, and then they just hit their targets. And ONI knew of that. So when people are saying, well, don't worry, they can never hit us in Pearl Harbor, it's like, oh, no,
there was a small group of people that did know, and
they were in Washington.
Yeah, they were either blind and asleep at the switch, or they didn't want to tell somebody. I don't know the answer to that, but it's really an interesting. It's part of the mystery of history,
Right.
The fog of history that we're trying to grope our way through.
The strange thing is, when you look into some of this, and I, reading your book and looking through some videos and that, I came across some people talking about ONI and how they learn, and they really study, and like you said, they want to figure out what went wrong. So when they have all these investigations, I guess I should say, and
lessons learned investigations. Yes,
right. I mean, they're very thorough on it. So
yes, they are.
When you say that when the Taranto thing, I should say,
that was November 1940. Right.
Right. So that's a year earlier. I mean, they had to know of this.
And Yamamoto certainly was aware of it, and it was one of the inspirations for what he wanted to do. I mean, both nations have been planning wargaming, attacking Hawaii for years, but I guess our hubris was such that we just didn't think it could happen because of our racial hubris and our
that's the official
willful
story.
blindness.
You know what I mean? That's the official story. I mean, if you look into it darker, I mean, your title is Deception, Intrigue, right? So
that's right. There is a lot of deception here, and there is intrigue. There's no doubt about that.
And you can make a case several times. Well, maybe they got lucky, or those aircraft carriers. It was just a kind of isn't it lucky they weren't there? And also the talk of the ships that were in there, were they quite dilapidated? Were they in there for major?
The ships that were the best ships had either been sent to the Atlantic to help with the war, the neutrality patrol in the Atlantic, or they were underway with the Enterprise on the Lexington. So all the obsolescent ships were in Pearl Harbor. Of course, the hidebound, the big gun club, they weren't thinking in those days of battleships being obsolescent, but in reality they were, because they were too slow. And it was too hard to get them from A to B to C to D, and they ate up too much fuel. So,
I think that you made I'm not sure if it's in your book or I just read researching it, that when the other aircraft carriers did leave, the rest of the battleships couldn't keep up, so they just turned around and came back.
That's right. Well, normally Kimmel would have half the ships at sea on every weekend, but because the two carriers that were in Pearl were sent to deliver fighter planes to Wake and Midway, he says, well, I have to keep all the battleships in port because there's no carrier aircraft to protect them at sea. So that ended up being the reason why all the ships were in port, which is like, oh my goodness. Talk about the domino effect.
But, so I think we're probably going to wrap up here a little bit because, we haven't even got into the attack on Pearl Harbor and Kimmel. But what I think we have got maybe is interested people to get your book, 2 books. That is, There's a lot more behind the story here, how this thing was manipulated, maneuvered, very devious, and like you talked about some chess moves that maybe take 10 moves to come to fruition. I mean, that's right. The amount of cables, the spying on the Germans as well. I mean, and it seems that everybody needed this to happen to get the gears moving. I mean, the Soviets,
and you know what?
The Soviets didn't want to be facing Japan.
I don't think Admiral Stark and General Marshall were idiots. I think they were loyal to the president's policy of making the enemy strike first. And these guys knew, let's wrap it up with this thought. These guys knew that we had 47% of the world's manufacturing power. That's a new statistic I've come up with since I published the book. Japan had 3.5%. We had 47%. Germany had 14%. The British had, the Russians had 14%. The British 10%. We had almost half of the world's manufacturing power. This is of what was actually produced during the war. And we had a sense of this. And that's why no matter how badly the war would start, I don't think these people in Washington or war planners were that worried about the Japanese. The planning already was that Germany would be first and we would be on the defensive against Japan until Hitler was defeated, and then we would crush Japan. That was always the planning. And I'd like to leave this with one thought then. I know we got to wrap this up. I think people should get the book and focus on the testimony of Admiral Turner, General Marshall, Admiral Stark, Secretary of War Stimson, but I'll leave you with one quote from Harry Hopkins. Now, Harry Hopkins was the Secretary of Commerce, but he was really the unofficial deputy president for Roosevelt. And he wrote a memo the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor, when the admirals and generals all met at the White House that afternoon. And listen to what he said, and then that'll be my swan song for tonight. He said, quote, "The conference met in not too tense an atmosphere because I think that all of us believed that in the last analysis the enemy was Hitler and that he could never be defeated without force of arms, that sooner or later we were bound to be in the war and that Japan had given us an opportunity," end quote. That's the day of the attack, when you would normally expect somebody to be in a state of panic. No panic.
Yeah, a number of people have made the comment that Roosevelt seemed a little bit too calm.
Yep. Right.
That and do you recall the quote from Churchill that night?
Oh, he many fine quotes, which I think I used them all. He wept with joy that he says, "After all, I know we've now won the war." He slept the sleep. He slept well for the first time in like 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
He says, now we've won. And that's what he said the day that we were attacked, because he knew what it meant.
Now, what you'll find if people purchase your book is it's for a lot of it, it's kind of like an Excel spreadsheet, and you get a date, and you get the dates, then you get the event, what happened, and then there's the remarks, and often, quoting documents and that. And when I first got it, and to tell you the truth, I even hesitated. I thought, I can't read this, and I found it a little uncomfortable. I just wanted to tell you, though, I got used to it. And then finally in book 2, when you come back to, I think, halfway through that, your conclusions and remarks about the whole story, the complete Pearl Harbor conclusions, Franklin D. Roosevelt, master of the game, and this is quite a game. It's back to normal and page by page, but if somebody does get it and it's a bit of a shock, I just wanted to mention it was a bit of a shock to me too, but I got used to it. And
I did that because no one had ever published a chronology of events as they happened, and in some cases it leads you to causality. I mean, the causality of different events becomes quite apparent when you put them in a timeline. That's why I did that.
You'll get, I think, a deeper. I'm not sure if respect is the right word, but understanding of Roosevelt and what he was up against, and
yes.
Yeah, I mean, quite a bit different than I thought of him. I thought of him, as a. I shouldn't say this, with any malice or anything. I thought him as like an uncle or a doddering, grandfather, something figure like that, and. He was the opposite of that. Especially, I was very surprised on his animosity to Churchill and to the UK, and I never dreamed that'd be happening. I mean, I learned quite a bit. I learned quite a bit. I'll say that.
Well, thank you, Len. I've really enjoyed discussing this with you, and I know you've given me a very generous amount of time, and I thank you so much, and encourage everyone to.
You're welcome, but I've got about 40 questions I went through, and I'm dropping a few of them, but. Oh, I've got more than that. I got 6 pages of stuff here. But like I said to you, that the reason we held off the interview is I wanted to make sure I read this and did some other work. I have a last question, so I will tell you. This is going to be our wrap-up question, though. But I wanted to ask you what role you thought maybe the FBI should have had in this, because there's quite a lot of spying. I'm at a bit of a loss to explain the FBI's role. And how would you describe the FBI in the surprise attack?
They looked more competent to me than I expected to find. I know I didn't write about it in my book, but in other books there are accounts of a Governor Burns, a man who was governor of Hawaii and was visited by President Kennedy in June of '63. Governor Burns. That Governor Burns, when he was a younger man, claims that he was told by an FBI agent that Pearl Harbor is going to be attacked, next week, and that it scared the hell out of him. That's really interesting. We know that, and I wrote about this, we know that J. Edgar Hoover knew about the Japanese spy in the consulate who was sending the weekly and maybe twice a week reports on the positions of all the U.S. ships in Pearl Harbor. He knew about that spy, and his link with Roosevelt was a diplomat named Adolph Burrell, and Burrell passed on the message to Hoover that, no, you're not allowed. Hoover wanted to arrest the guy and throw him in jail or arrest him and deport him. And the answer was, no, you're not allowed to do that. The president knows he's the spy, and that would reveal our code-breaking success, and we can't reveal that to the Japanese, so you cannot arrest the man. So I think they were as diligent as they could be in some areas.
But when you read these things,
the game was a lot bigger than them,
Yeah, but when you read this, you start to wonder who didn't know about the attack coming.
I know. That's right. You start to wonder who didn't. The suspects right now, the list of suspects is George Marshall, Admiral Stark, Admiral Turner, Admiral Wilkinson, the head of O&I, apparently at least one FBI agent in Hawaii. I think his name was Shivers. Certainly the Dutch naval attaché, Commander McCollum, and of course the code breakers. Well, not the code breakers. The people at the intercept stations in the Pacific Rim, who had the radio direction finding equipment, who were reporting positions of ships they certainly knew something was coming toward Hawaii.
And you made the comment. You made the comment that the British were possibly a year ahead in this code breaking.
Yes, in JN-25 code breaking. Yes, we had effect. According to Captain Safford of the U.S. Navy, years later, we had effectively solved the JN-25 puzzle by December 7th, but we were reading traffic that was a month old in Washington. It was being sent by airplane and ship and train to Washington after it was intercepted. So that's the tragedy from that standpoint, is they had essentially solved it and more or less knew how to do it. They didn't have enough people. The people were devoted to the diplomatic magic messages. They didn't have enough people devoted to breaking JN-25, and they were reading month-old messages. But the British had a lot more people assigned to it, both at Bletchley Park and in the Far East, and they were way ahead of us. Way ahead.
Right, and you start with thinking with some common sense about November 26th and the messages that were going out then. I mean,
right. Like the vacancy message and the war warnings the next day and everything else, right? And the carriers, send the carriers out to deliver fighter planes. So there's a lot to chew on here. And, it's a nuanced argument, but I think it's the best synthesis of all the revisionist arguments in the past. I think I've put together things, connected the dots in a better way than some of the older revisionist historians who were writing in the late 40s and early 50s and the mid 50s, and we know a lot more now than we knew then.
Now, how long have you spent on this? How long did it take you to write these two books?
The 2 volumes took off and on. I worked on it for 6 years, a lot of times only on the weekends. And then you reach something in your life happens and you have to put it down for a while. And then you always go back to it, but off and on for 6 years, from 2010 to the end of 2016.
Well, I'll leave you with this. Mr. Horne, I learned an awful lot from reading your books, so I hope other people get that out of it as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thank you for spending time with me to discuss this. And once again, where is the book available? Amazon?
Amazon.com, Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War. Or you can put in my last name, Horne, and just type FDR, and it'll pop right up.
Yeah. Do you have a personal website? Or
not for this book, I don't.
Oh, I thought you had
Maybe I should.
A blog page, I thought.
But I've got an old blog page inside the ARRB. And I did announce the publication of this book, but other than that, I haven't really promoted it as much as I should have. So for that reason, I thank you very much for the time.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. And I'll speak to you. Are you working on another book? Are you still going to be writing?
No, I'm just, I'm trying to catch my breath. I am going to teach I'm so excited. I'm going to teach a course about this book. It's to retired adults, and it's a retired adult education. It's going to be this fall here in Cleveland, and I'm going to have a lot of fun. I've never taught a course before. I've already got the PowerPoint finished. All 151 slides are ready to go. I can't wait.
Please let me know when you're ready for that, and I'll have you on again, and we can promote that and make sure people in that area know how to sign up for it. And
thank you.
You're very welcome.
Okay,
all right,
take care.
Good night.
The Plot to Kill King by William Pepper. William Pepper was James Earl Ray's lawyer in the trial for the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. And even after Ray's conviction and death, Pepper continues to adamantly argue Ray's innocence. This myth-shattering expose is a revised, updated, and heavily expanded volume of Pepper's original best-selling and critically acclaimed book, Orders to Kill, with 26 years of additional research included. The result reveals dramatic new details of the night of the murder, the trial, and why Ray was chosen to take the fall for an evil conspiracy, a government-sanctioned assassination of our nation's greatest leader. The plan, according to Pepper, was for a team of United States Army Special Forces snipers to kill King, but just as they were taking him, a backup civilian assassin pulled the trigger. In The Plot to Kill King, Pepper shares the evidence and testimonies that prove that Ray was a fall guy chosen by those who viewed King as a dangerous revolutionary. His findings make the book one of the most important of our time. the uncensored story of the murder of an American hero that contains disturbing revelations about the obscure inner workings of our government and how it continues, even today, to obscure the truth. The Plot to Kill King by William Pepper. Black Op Radio is pleased to announce a direct download section. That's right. Now you can purchase all archive shows and specialty packages such as the John Armstrong interview, Doug Horne, Jim Douglas, Jim Diogenio, and more. So instead of having to wait with regular mail, you can get shows you want in minutes directly to your computer. Check out the direct download section at blackopradio.com.
Black Op Radio presents Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, the DVD Complete Collection. Finally, the DVD set you've been waiting for is available. Over 15 hours with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. Over 15 hours. Interviews with Len Osanek, John Judge, David Ratcliffe, and more. This is a one-of-a-kind set. These interviews feature Fletcher Prouty having candid conversations regarding his 23 years in the military, but specifically 9 years in the Pentagon from 1955 to 1964. His inside knowledge is invaluable to researchers of this era of American and world history. These are the revelations you've been waiting for. Over 15 hours with Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, the complete DVD collection. Available at the Colonel Prouty reference site, www.prouty.org, and blackopradio.com. It's a political rally, a free speech zone, a town hall meeting. It's an interrogation at NSA headquarters. Now, it's time to make a statement. Time to represent. Time to let them know who you are. That you're part of the Black Op. With a brand new Black Op Radio t-shirt. Comes in all sizes. Wear it loud and proud. Join the Black Op today. www.blackopradio.com. If you believe there's more to the JFK assassination and the mystery surrounding the CIA and its covert operations, you're not alone. Meet the man Oliver Stone called X in the epic motion picture JFK. Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty comes forward with never-before-seen or heard documentation and information about JFK, the Vietnam War, the CIA, and more on a brand-new CD-ROM. The collected works of Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty is an incredible offer not to be missed. For a limited time only, find the answers surrounding these issues and more with the collected works of Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty. Or visit the Colonel Prouty reference site on the World Wide Web, the collected works of Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty.